Ma'am, are you sure about this? Gus's voice crackled through the headset, laced with a healthy dose of disbelief. Below us, the manicured lawns of Serenity Meadows looked like a meticulously arranged diorama, each house a pastel-colored sugar cube. Except for one, my house. Currently the target of a low-flying, olive-drab behemoth. Positive, Gus, I replied, gripping the armrest of the HOA. The vibrations rattled my teeth. Roxy, our unflappable pilot, adjusted her aviator sunglasses, a slight smirk playing on her lips. Just hover directly over my property line, the one bordering, well, what was the brush fire access road? But the rose bushes, Alex. And the... Is that a gnome? Gus sounded genuinely distressed. He was a man who'd poured concrete in hurricanes and framed houses during earthquakes. Suburban horticulture shouldn't be his breaking point. Collateral damage, Gus, I said, trying to sound more cavalier than I felt. My gaze was fixed on the tiny figure standing amidst the offending shrubbery. A woman whose dedication to enforcing arbitrary aesthetic standards had somehow escalated to this. Me, in a helicopter, about to drop a three-man construction crew and enough tools to build a small shed directly onto my own land. All because of a mailbox and a path. 4 minutes earlier, Brenda, the self-appointed queen of curb appeal and HOA president with the iron fist in a pastel glove, had stood triumphantly in front of her newly erected monument to petty tyranny. A line of thorny rose bushes and a ridiculously quaint white picket fence, bisecting a legally designated access route. Her reasoning, delivered with the unwavering conviction of a zealot, had been something about community harmony and the unsightly nature of a dirt path. My response? Well, let's just say that after a decade spent wrangling software code and navigating corporate bureaucracy, I'd developed a certain efficiency when faced with illogical obstacles. And right now, the most efficient way to get my construction crew and their gear to the back of my property, where my dream workshop awaited, involved bypassing Brenda's botanical blockade entirely, hence the helicopter. Roxy gave me a thumbs up. Ready when you are, buddy. I took a deep breath, the roar of the rotors filling the cabin. Gus, you and the boys ready to rappel? Rappel? Alex, we're carrying a jackhammer and enough lumber to build Noah's Ark. We were expecting a road. Improvise, adapt, overcome, Gus. Isn't that your motto when the concrete truck gets stuck in a ditch? A sigh that could curdle milk came through the headset. Just try not to land the damn chopper on my toolbox. No promises, I muttered, then spoke into my own mic. Roxy, let's do this. The helicopter shifted, hovering with a surprising degree of stability considering its size. Below, Brenda had finally looked up, her watering can frozen mid-air. Her face, previously set in a smugly self-righteous expression, was slowly morphing into something resembling a goldfish gasping for air. This was going to be glorious. Let's rewind a bit. To the beige beginning of this suburban saga. Because as ridiculous as the image of a construction crew dangling from a helicopter over a suburban garden might be, the journey to get there was paved with equal parts absurdity and escalating annoyance. It all started with the mailbox. I'd moved into Serenity Meadows about 2 months ago, seeking refuge from the relentless pace of the tech world after selling my company for a sum that allowed me to finally indulge in my lifelong passion. Woodworking. My new house, nestled on a relatively large 2-acre lot at the edge of the development, had the potential for the perfect workshop. A sprawling, climate-controlled haven where I could lose myself in the scent of sawdust and the satisfying hum of power tools. The house itself was adequate. Standard suburban fare. But the mailbox it came with was an abomination. A rusted, vaguely colonial affair that looked like it belonged in a historical reenactment of the Pony Express. So, naturally, one of the first things I did was replace it with a sleek, modern, charcoal gray model. Functional. Understated. Exactly what I wanted. The next morning, nestled amongst the junk mail, was the dreaded envelope with the Serenity Meadows Homeowners Association logo. Inside, a crisp white sheet informed me, in no uncertain terms, that my mailbox was in violation of Covenant Article 3, Section B, Paragraph 2, which stipulated that all mailboxes must be Grage-4 to maintain community aesthetic harmony. Failure to comply would result in a daily fine of $25. My first encounter with Brenda, the self-appointed arbiter of Serenity Meadows aesthetic harmony, occurred on my driveway that afternoon. She arrived with Gary, her silent, perpetually nodding husband, who trailed a few feet behind her like a well-trained Labrador. Brenda was a woman of a certain age, with a severe bob haircut, sensible shoes, and the unwavering gaze of someone who had just finished reading a self-help book on assertiveness. She clutched a 3-ring binder that I would soon learn contained the sacred texts of the HOA covenants. "Mr. Alex Thompson," she began, her voice a precise blend of polite condescension. "Just Alex," I replied, trying to keep the irritation out of my voice. "And you are?" "Brenda Miller, president of the Serenity Meadows Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your mailbox." She gestured towards the offending charcoal gray with a disapproving tilt of her head. I tried the reasonable approach. "It's a mailbox, Brenda. It receives mail. Functionally, it's perfect. And frankly, I think the charcoal gray is quite tasteful." Brenda's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Taste is subjective, Mr. Thompson. Covenant Article 3, Section B, Paragraph 2 is not. It clearly states all mailboxes must be painted in the approved Grage-4 color." She tapped the binder for emphasis. "Community harmony is built on a foundation of aesthetic cohesion. Your non-compliant mailbox disrupts that harmony." Gary nodded vigorously. I blinked. "Grage-4? Is that even a real color?" "It is the color approved by the board," Brenda stated firmly. "Samples are available at the Sherwin-Williams on Route 7. The thought of spending my Saturday morning selecting from various shades of beige made my soul wither. "Look, Brenda, with all due respect, are we seriously talking about the color of my mailbox?" "We are talking about upholding the standards of our community, Mr. Thompson. Standards that you agreed to abide by when you purchased your property." She had a point, technically. I vaguely remembered signing a mountain of paperwork at closing. Somewhere in that bureaucratic Everest, I'm sure the Grage-4 commandment was inscribed. "And the fine?" I asked, trying to sound less defeated than I felt. "It accrues daily until the violation is rectified." Her tone softened slightly, the practiced empathy of a seasoned enforcer. "We don't want to fine you, Mr. Thompson. We simply want you to be a good neighbor and comply with the regulations." "Good neighbor?" That stung a little. I wasn't trying to be a bad neighbor. I just wanted a mailbox that didn't look like it belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting. Defeated, I sighed. "Fine, Brenda. Grage it is." She beamed, a genuine smile finally breaking through. "Excellent. I knew you'd see reason." Gary punctuated her statement with another enthusiastic nod. As they walked away, Brenda pausing to admire Mrs. Henderson's perfectly manicured petunias, I stared at my charcoal gray mailbox. This was it, I thought. This was suburban life. Trading the exhilarating chaos of the tech startup world for the soul-crushing tyranny of beige. Little did I know, the mailbox was just the opening act. The real drama was about to unfold at the back of my property, where my dreams of sawdust and power tools were about to collide with Brenda's vision of a perfectly manicured, regulation-compliant utopia, My plan was simple: build a substantial workshop guest house at the rear of my 2-acre lot. It would be roughly the size of a small house, fully insulated, wired for heavy-duty machinery, and with enough natural light to make even the gloomiest day feel productive. I hired Gus, a contractor whose website promised quality work, no bullshit. His initial assessment of the project was characteristically blunt. "Big job. Gonna need heavy equipment. How we getting back there without tearing up your fancy driveway?" That's when I remembered it. The faint, overgrown path that ran along the southern edge of my property line, bordering a patch of undeveloped woods. I'd seen it on the property survey. Gus pulled out the county plat map. There it was, clearly marked: Brush Fire Access Road. A dotted line with a label that hadn't seen the light of day in years. "This is it," Gus said, pointing. "Easement. We clear this out, lay down some gravel, and bingo. Back access without touching the community roads. County and fire department will sign off on it, no problem." It seemed like the perfect solution. A logical, efficient way to get the job done without disrupting the delicate ecosystem of Serenity Meadows' pristine landscaping. I pictured Brenda's satisfied nod, relieved that no heavy trucks would be rumbling down her precious cul-de-sac. "Sounds good to me," I said, feeling a rare surge of optimism. Gus, ever the pragmatist, just grunted. "Famous last words, kid." He wasn't wrong. Being a creature of habit and a firm believer in documentation, I didn't just take Gus's word for it. The next day I spent a good chunk of time on the phone and sending emails. I called the county planning office, spoke to a surprisingly bored clerk who seemed more interested in her lunch break than zoning regulations. I emailed the local fire marshal, outlining my plans and attaching a copy of the plat map. The responses were reassuringly bureaucratic. The county clerk's email was short and to the point. As long as the access road is restored to a usable condition afterward, the county has no objections. The fire marshal was equally pragmatic. The brush fire access road must remain unobstructed during periods of high fire risk. Its use for temporary construction access is acceptable, provided it is cleared and maintained to a minimum width of 12 feet. Both emails were printed, highlighted, and filed in a meticulously labeled folder. I felt smugly prepared. I had done my due diligence. I had the weight of local government bureaucracy on my side. What could possibly go wrong? The answer arrived with the sound of a 2-stroke engine. Gus's crew, a couple of burly guys named Earl and Dwayne, showed up early one morning with a brush hog, chainsaws, and a can-do attitude. They disappeared down the overgrown path, and for a few blissful hours, the sounds of suburban tranquility were replaced by the roar of machinery and the satisfying crackle of snapping branches. By late morning, a surprisingly wide path had emerged, revealing the faint remnants of an old dirt road beneath the years of accumulated foliage. It wasn't pretty, but it was functional. Then, as if summoned by the disruption of her perfectly ordered world, Brenda appeared. She marched down my driveway, her face a mask of righteous indignation, Gary trailing silently behind. She stopped at the edge of the newly cleared path, her gaze sweeping over the slightly muddy terrain with an expression of utter horror. "Mr. Thompson!" she exclaimed, her voice tight with barely suppressed fury. "What in the name of all that is green and harmonious is going on here?" I walked over, feeling a familiar wave of preemptive exasperation. "Good morning, Brenda. We're clearing the brush fire access road to bring in equipment for my workshop." I gestured towards the county plat map I had thoughtfully brought outside. "See? It's a legal easement." I even pointed to the fire marshal's email on my phone screen. Brenda waved a dismissive hand, as if swatting away a particularly annoying fly. "That's just the government, Alex. The community has its own standards. This desecration of a vital community greenbelt is completely unacceptable." "Greenbelt?" I blinked. Brenda, it was an overgrown patch of weeds and poison ivy. It was natural, she insisted. A haven for local wildlife. And now it looks like a construction site. It will be used temporarily for construction access and then restored, I explained patiently. I have it in writing from the county and the fire department. Brenda's eyes narrowed. The HOA board was not consulted on this matter. Well, I didn't think I needed to, I said, trying to keep my tone even. It's a legal easement. It doesn't affect the community roads or common areas. Everything affects the community, Mr. Thompson, she declared, her voice rising. And this path is not in harmony with the Serenity Meadows aesthetic. She informed me that an emergency meeting of the HOA board would be held that evening to discuss this flagrant violation. As she stormed back towards her perfectly manicured lawn, Gary offering a series of apologetic nods in my direction, I stared at the cleared path. I had followed all the rules, consulted the relevant authorities, and found a solution that seemed to bypass the potential for HOA drama. Yet here we were. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of unease. I had a bad feeling about that emergency meeting. Stepping out onto my porch, the source of my apprehension became horrifyingly clear. Brenda, Gary, and a small posse of what I could only assume were equally aesthetically obsessed neighbors were on the access road. They were planting rose bushes, a thick, thorny line of them, directly across the cleared path. And between the rose bushes, gleaming white in the morning sun, was a newly erected white picket fence. It looked like something out of a particularly saccharine greeting card. Driven into the freshly disturbed earth beside this horticultural barricade was a professionally made sign. It read, Serenity Meadows Community Garden and Nature Preserve, Est 2025. No trespassing. My phone rang. It was Gus. His voice was flat, devoid of its usual sardonic humor. Alex, you might want to come take a look at your access situation. I walked down to the nature preserve. My jaw clenched. Brenda was there, trowel in hand, carefully patting mulch around the base of a particularly vibrant red rose. She looked up and offered a sickly sweet smile. Good morning, Mr. Thompson, she chirped, as if we were discussing the weather. Isn't it lovely? The board voted last night. We've officially reclaimed this unsightly scar on the landscape for the community's enjoyment. It's in the bylaws, Section 9, Article C, Improvement of Common Areas. I stared at the fence, at the rose bushes, at the sign that brazenly declared a legal easement to be a nature preserve. My carefully constructed wall of patience crumbled. Brenda, I said, my voice dangerously low. You know this is a designated fire access road. You know I have permits to use it for construction. What you've done is illegal. She tilted her head, feigning innocence. Illegal? Oh, I don't think so, Mr. Thompson. We're simply beautifying a neglected area for the benefit of the community. And besides, she added with a smug little smile, how are you going to get your big, noisy construction equipment past this? That was it. That was the moment. The reasonable man had reached his absolute limit. The petty tyranny, the blatant disregard for logic and legality, the sheer audacity of planting roses in the face of common sense. Something inside me snapped as I stood there, staring at the picket fence. A ridiculous thought popped into my head, something Gus had said earlier in a moment of exasperation about the blocked path. What are you gonna do, Alex? Airlift the damn excavator in? And in that absurd, exasperated question, a spark ignited. A glorious, vengeful, utterly impractical spark. Brenda wanted to play games? Fine. I had a feeling I was about to become very, very good at playing Brenda's kind of games. Only my games would have helicopters. Back in my office, the wheels of Operation Air Superiority were already turning. Gus was on speakerphone, his usual deadpan delivery tinged with a hint of morbid curiosity. "So, you're serious about this helicopter thing?" "Absolutely serious, Gus," I replied, pacing my office floor like a caged tiger. "She wants to block my access? I'll go over her head, literally." "It's gonna cost you a fortune, kid." "My fortune, Gus," I corrected him. "And frankly, after dealing with Brenda and her rose bushes, I consider it a worthwhile investment in my sanity." He sighed. All right. I know a guy who knows a guy who runs a charter service out of the regional airfield. Specializes in, well, usually hauling rich folks to their vacation homes. But he's got a Bell 212. Lift capacity of about 5,000 pounds, like I said. "Get me his number, Gus." The connection crackled as Gus rattled off a name and number. I hung up and immediately dialed. A woman answered, her voice professional and slightly bored. "Roxy's Rotors, this is Carol." "Hi, Carol. My name is Alex Thompson. Gus Henderson suggested I call you. I have a somewhat unusual transportation request." I explained the situation, carefully omitting the more colorful details about HOA presidents and picket fences. I focused on the blocked access road and the need to get construction personnel and equipment to the rear of my property. There was a brief silence on the other end. Then, a different voice, one with a cool, no-nonsense tone, came on the line. "This is Roxy. Carol said you need to airlift some stuff?" "Essentially, yes," I confirmed. "I need to transport a small construction crew, 3 people, along with some tools and a generator to a landing zone on my property." "And why can't they just drive there?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. "There's an obstruction," I said delicately. "A very determined obstruction involving rose bushes and a fence." Another pause. Then, a low chuckle. "All right. I've heard stranger things. Where are you located?" I gave her my address. She punched it into her GPS. I could almost hear the digital whirring over the phone. "Got it. Looks like a decent-sized backyard. Clear of power lines?" "Completely." "All right, Mr. Thompson. Let's talk logistics and price." Meeting Roxy the next day at the small regional airfield was an experience. She was leaning against the massive olive-drab Huey, chewing gum with a steady, rhythmic motion, as if she were personally responsible for keeping the rotors turning. She wore faded jeans, a leather jacket, and those aviator sunglasses that somehow managed to convey both authority and a complete lack of concern for the opinions of others. I recounted the saga of the mailbox, the access road, the rose bushes, and the picket fence. I braced myself for laughter, for disbelief, for her to tell me I was completely out of my mind. Roxy just listened, occasionally nodding. When I finished, she took the gum out of her mouth and flicked it into a nearby trash can. "So, let me get this straight," she said, her gaze direct. "You need me to long-line a 3-man construction crew and their gear into your backyard because the head of your neighborhood watch doesn't like your choice of landscaping?" "That is the most accurate and brutally honest summary I have ever heard," I admitted. Roxy shrugged. "People are weird. Landing zone is definitely clear?" "Absolutely. It's a wide open space." "All right. We can do it. It'll be a bit more complicated than just dropping them off, given the equipment. We'll probably need a couple of lifts. And it's going to cost you." She named a price that made my eyes water, but frankly, at that point, I would have paid double. "Cash or card?" she asked, her expression unreadable. "Wire transfer okay?" "Fine. Let's do it tomorrow morning. 7 a.m. sharp. My guys will meet your crew at the north end of your property line." She gave me a curt nod and turned back to the helicopter, already running through pre-flight checks in her head. I walked away from the airfield feeling a bizarre mixture of anxiety and exhilaration. I was about to engage in a ridiculously over-the-top act of suburban defiance, and I couldn't wait to see Brenda's face. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Gus and his two-man crew, Earl and Dwayne, were waiting at the designated pickup point, looking slightly bewildered but also vaguely amused. I gave them a quick rundown of the plan, emphasizing the no sudden movements rule during the airlift. Back in my house, I could see a few curious neighbors peeking through their blinds. Brenda, however, was nowhere in sight. I assumed she was still basking in the glory of her horticultural victory. Then, at precisely 7:12 a.m., we heard it. A low whump 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 in the distance. The sound grew steadily louder, and soon the massive olive-drab silhouette of Roxy's Huey appeared over the tree line. It wasn't just passing by. It was descending, towards my backyard. Brenda chose that exact moment to emerge from her house, watering can in hand. She looked up, annoyed, probably assuming it was a news helicopter covering some local traffic incident. Then, the Huey hovered directly over my property line, the downdraft from the rotors whipping the leaves on the trees into a frenzy. A harness and sling dropped down. Gus, Earl, and Dwayne, looking like a bizarre suburban SWAT team, clipped themselves in. Slowly, majestically, they were lifted off the ground, dangling precariously beneath the helicopter. Then, they were swung over the community garden and nature preserve, directly over Brenda's head, her watering can now forgotten, her mouth agape in utter disbelief. Next came the tools, a generator, compressors, various power tools, all carefully secured. It took 2 trips. By the time the helicopter finally banked away, heading back towards the airfield, Gus and his crew were safely on the ground in my backyard, waving cheerfully at a still frozen Brenda. Gus even gave a thumbs up. The generator roared to life, and the sounds of construction began. Brenda had cut off my access road at 4:12 p.m. the previous afternoon. It was now 7:16 a.m. It had taken her 15 hours to build a wall of roses and a picket fence. It had taken me 4 minutes to fly over it. She had brought a white picket fence to an air assault fight, and she had lost, spectacularly. The immediate aftermath was chaotic, to say the least. Brenda, understandably, lost it. I imagine her 911 call was a masterpiece of suburban hysteria, something along the lines of an illegal military invasion of her nature preserve. A single squad car, driven by Officer Miller, arrived about 20 minutes later. Officer Miller looked like he was about 2 weeks away from retirement and had seen it all, twice. His young, eager partner, Officer Davis, was practically bouncing with anticipation. Brenda, still sputtering with outrage, launched into a frantic explanation of the helicopter assault, the desecrated garden, the sheer audacity of it all. Davis diligently took notes, his pen flying across the notepad. Miller just stood there, observing the scene with the weary resignation of a man who has responded to one too many disputes about misplaced garden gnomes. I calmly explained my side of the story, presenting my printed emails from the county and the fire marshal. I emphasized the legal easement and the temporary nature of the construction access. "So, let me get this straight, Mr. Thompson," Officer Davis said, looking slightly bewildered. "You hired a helicopter to transport your construction crew onto your own property?" "That is correct, officer," I replied. "The previously designated access route was temporarily unavailable." I glanced pointedly at the remnants of the picket fence. Officer Miller, who hadn't said a word up until that point, finally spoke, addressing Brenda. "Ma'am, is this Mr. Thompson's property?" "Yes, but he flew over the garden," she sputtered. "The airspace above the garden?" Miller asked, his voice flat. "Yes." Miller sighed, a sound that spoke volumes about his career choices. "Ma'am, you don't own the sky." He turned to me, a flicker of something that might have been amusement in his eyes. "Mr. Thompson, as long as your activities are confined to your property and you haven't violated any airspace regulations, I don't see a crime here. Though," he added, looking at the downed fence, "I suspect the HOA might have a few things to say." Davis, still trying to wrap his head around the situation, flipped through his municipal codebook. "Sir, do you have a permit for aerial personnel deployment?" Miller just shook his head. "Rookie," he muttered under his breath. He advised Brenda to take her complaints to the HOA and, with a final, world-weary glance at the construction site, got back in his patrol car. Davis, still looking slightly lost, followed suit. The departure of the police car did not, however, signal the end of Brenda's campaign. Humiliated but undeterred, she shifted her tactics. If she couldn't stop the construction, she would make my life as inconvenient as humanly possible through the iron fist of HOA regulations. The fines began almost immediately. Noise violation for the generator, despite it being well within daytime decibel limits. Unapproved temporary structure for the portable toilet Gus's crew insisted on having. Improper storage of construction materials, a neatly stacked pile of lumber. And, of course, the daily $25 fine for the unauthorized charcoal gray mailbox, which I still hadn't gotten around to painting. That's when I called Jessica. Jessica was my lawyer. She specialized in resolving complex property disputes with extreme prejudice. Her hourly rate was enough to make my eyes water. But after dealing with Brenda, I figured it was a worthwhile investment in my long-term peace of mind. Jessica listened to my story, occasionally interjecting with a sharp question. By the end of the call, I could practically hear the gears turning in her formidable legal mind. The cease and desist letter she sent to the HOA was a masterpiece of legal jargon, citing state laws that superseded HOA bylaws regarding reasonable access for property improvement and outlining the definition of harassment. It included phrases like tortious interference and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I didn't understand half of it, but it sounded suitably intimidating. The letter had a temporary effect. The fine stopped, at least for a week. But the underlying tension in Serenity Meadows remained. The neighborhood had become subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, divided. There were whispers behind manicured hedges, pointed glances at community barbecues. Some neighbors, mostly those who meticulously adhered to every single HOA regulation, saw me as a disruptive force, a rogue element who had brought chaos to their perfectly ordered lives. Others, perhaps those who had secretly chafed under Brenda's iron rule, saw me as a folk hero, the one person brave, or perhaps crazy, enough to stand up to the HOA. A silent Team Alex versus Team Brenda dynamic had emerged. Construction on the workshop continued, albeit with the occasional dramatic arrival of building materials via Roxy's rotors. These deliveries had become a weekly spectacle, drawing curious onlookers and eliciting scandalized gasps from the Brenda faction. Roxy, ever the professional, just waved from the cockpit. Weeks turned into a month. The workshop began to take shape, the framing rising against the backdrop of the perfectly manicured suburban landscape. The legal battle with the HOA simmered, a stalemate of increasingly angry letters exchanged between Jessica and the HOA's equally aggressive legal team. And then, the weather changed. The late summer heat descended on Serenity Meadows like a heavy blanket. The air was thick and dry, the once lush green lawns beginning to show patches of brown, despite the diligent efforts of sprinkler systems. The news reports started carrying warnings: high temperatures, low humidity, and strong winds creating a significant risk of brush fires in the surrounding hills. The entire region was under a red flag warning. Gus, ever attuned to the practical realities of the world beyond HOA regulations, surveyed the dry, tinderbox-like vegetation surrounding our little suburban bubble with a worried frown. "This is bad, kid," he said one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow. "Real bad. All it takes is one stray spark, one idiot with a barbecue, and this whole place could go up." His words, usually delivered with a dose of his signature cynicism, carried a new weight. I looked at the blocked access road, the rose bushes now thriving around the stubbornly defiant picket fence. Its original purpose, a route for emergency vehicles, suddenly felt far more significant than just a convenient way for construction trucks to reach my backyard. Then, a thin column of gray smoke appeared on the horizon, rising from the ridge a few miles away. It was small at first, almost insignificant. But within minutes, fueled by the dry air and wind, it grew, darkening and spreading like an ominous ink stain against the clear blue sky. The distant wail of sirens began to drift on the breeze. The neighborhood text chain erupted. Panic-stricken messages flew back and forth. "Is that smoke? Where is it coming from? Should we evacuate?" Brenda, ever the voice of authority, even if her authority was now somewhat diminished, posted a message urging calm and reminding everyone to ensure their lawn ornaments were secured against the high winds. My immediate reaction was to call 911, reporting the fire's approximate location relative to Serenity Meadows. Then, my fingers flew across my phone screen, dialing Roxy's number. "Roxy," I said, my voice urgent. "Hypothetical question. What's your chopper's water-dropping capacity?" A fire engine, a large brush truck equipped for off-road terrain, arrived at the entrance to Serenity Meadows, its flashing lights a stark contrast to the pastel hues of the surrounding houses. The fire captain, a no-nonsense man in his turnout gear, unfolded a map and immediately identified the brush fire access road as the quickest route to get behind the houses and potentially create a crucial fire break. The truck rumbled down my street and stopped abruptly in front of the picket fence and the community garden. The fire captain got out, his expression grim, and strode towards Brenda, who had emerged from her house, her face a mixture of fear and indignation at the disruption of her street. "Ma'am," the captain said, his voice loud and authoritative, "I need this road cleared, now." Brenda, her eyes wide with alarm, but her sense of self-importance still stubbornly intact, planted her feet. "This is a protected nature preserve. You can't just drive a truck through here." "Ma'am," the captain replied, his patience clearly wearing thin, "that is a designated fire access road on my map, and there is a fire heading this way. You have 30 seconds to remove this fence, or my truck will." He gestured towards the massive bumper of the brush truck. Just then, a familiar police cruiser pulled up. Officers Miller and Davis. Miller, I could tell, had that weary, seen-it-all look on his face, but there was also a hint of something else. Maybe amusement, maybe just the grim satisfaction of a prophecy fulfilled, under the very real threat of being arrested for obstructing a firefighter during an emergency. Brenda's resolve finally crumbled. With trembling hands, she and a few of her equally flustered disciples began to dismantle the precious picket fence, the rose bushes suffering collateral damage in the chaotic process. The neighbors, drawn by the commotion, watched in stunned silence. As the fire truck slowly rumbled through the remains of the nature preserve and up the long-neglected path, I was already on the phone with the fire captain. "Captain," I said, my voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through me. "This is Alex Thompson. I own the property at the top of the access road. My construction site is clear and level. It's at your disposal as a staging area. I also have a 1,000-gallon water tank for my concrete mix. You're welcome to it." There was a brief pause on the other end. Then, a voice filled with weary gratitude replied, "Mr. Thompson, that would be a huge help. We appreciate it." "And Captain," I added, I also have a private helicopter about 5 minutes out. The pilot can provide aerial reconnaissance and help direct your crews." Another pause, this one filled with surprised appreciation. "Mr. Thompson," the captain said, "you've just made our job a whole lot easier. Thank you." Minutes later, Roxy's HOA appeared, not for a dramatic supply drop this time, but to circle the growing fire, providing real-time intelligence to the firefighters on the ground. My half-finished workshop site, once the target of Brenda's aesthetic disapproval, became a temporary command center, the 1,000-gallon water tank, a vital resource. For the first time since moving to Serenity Meadows, I felt like I was actually contributing something positive to the community, something beyond maintaining a Grage #4 mailbox. 1 month later, Serenity Meadows was slowly returning to its meticulously ordered state, albeit with a few notable changes. Brenda had been unceremoniously removed as HOA president, facing not only the collective disapproval of the neighborhood, but also a hefty fine from the county for obstructing emergency access. The picket fence was gone, replaced by a large official sign from the fire department, clearly designating the route as a brush fire access road keep clear. My workshop was finally complete, a spacious, light-filled haven that smelled gloriously of cedar and possibility. Gus, Roxy, and even a now-retired Officer Miller were there for a celebratory barbecue, the aroma of grilling burgers mingling with the scent of freshly cut wood. The new HOA board, a significantly less aesthetically zealous group, had sent me a formal letter. It was a sincere thank you for my assistance during the fire, acknowledging that the use of the access road had been crucial in the firefighting efforts. They also informed me that all of Brenda's frivolous fines had been rescinded. Later that evening, as the last of my guests departed, I stood in front of my house. In my hand, I held a can of spray paint. It was Grage #4. I looked at my sleek charcoal gray mailbox. I looked at the can of paint. A small smile played on my lips. I tossed the can into the trash bin and walked into my new workshop, the gentle hum of the climate control a welcome sound. Harmony, I decided, was overrated. But a good workshop? That was priceless. And sometimes you just needed a helicopter to remind everyone of what really mattered.